It's great to be here talking about the second edition of my book. The first edition was financed by PACT, and I'm very grateful to Stephen Pickard for allowing me to write the book. So why the second edition? I wanted to expand the book in light of new inquiries that are happening around the world, particularly in Europe, but also to update some of the data from the earlier inquiries. For example, the Irish inquiry concluded about 20 years ago now. So I wanted to update the findings to see essentially where we are now, which is the title of my talk. So the new inquiries I analysed, firstly, Pennsylvania inquiry, which is an older inquiry. It was completed in 2016. So I might say this book's a little bit more controversial than the first book.
Which was very controversial.
I realised that the publisher was on board with what I was doing, so I thought I'd go and pick up the controversial things I missed in the first book. So I wanted to do the Pennsylvania inquiry because the Supreme Court ordered parts of the inquiry to be permanently redacted. And the reason they did that was in response to appellants of the Supreme Court who claimed that findings of the Pennsylvania inquiry that related to them were not supported by a preponderance of evidence, which is a standard of grand jury inquiries, and that the evidence in relation to them was false or misleading. They argued they'd been denied due process of law and said that the release of the findings to the public would damage their reputation in violation of their constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court agreed. Now, some of these, they were all priests, had very convincing evidence that the allegations against them were false. I mean, I'll give you one example. Somebody would have been 10 years old when he was said to have committed the offence and therefore could not be a priest and wasn't at a parish, etc. Now, we all know in allegations of historical child sex abuse, sometimes the difference between a year or two is a lapse of memory and not a big deal. But when you're talking about decades, that does become convincing evidence that maybe this allegation is false. I also wanted to, I also included the Canadian inquiry into residential homes. So I ummed and ahed about this because this is very controversial. I'm not sure if you're aware of what's been going on. You're aware, yeah. So the focus of this inquiry wasn't primarily child sexual abuse, which is the focus of my book, although sexual abuse did occur in the residential homes and there's evidence for that. But rather, I wanted it in the book to demonstrate how much damage can be done to the church with unproven accusations. And in fact, in Canada, as a result of the media reporting of this inquiry, not so much the findings of the inquiry, more so the media reporting, 100 churches were damaged, they were burnt down, there were protests in the street, etc. And these were all on unproven allegations of mass murder, basically. So if you're not aware of the inquiry, the unrest arose in response to misinformation concerning two claims in the inquiry. One claim was that the assimilation program run by the Canadian government and facilitated in part by the church, not only the Catholic Church, other denominations, was an instance of cultural genocide. So the definition of genocide, cultural genocide, according to the Genocide Convention, includes forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And it was claimed that this could apply in this case. So I don't really discuss that claim. That's hotly contested. It's not my area of expertise, but I'm just setting the background for the protests and violence against the Catholic Church that erupted in Canada. Excuse me. So a second important claim, or the second important aspect of the inquiry, was that there were a number of undocumented deaths. So 3,200 deaths of named, were on an unnamed and unnamed register with the Indigenous reporting agency, but they weren't found with the church. So there was a gap of about 32% of undocumented deaths. And due to rumours and some work with ground penetrating radar that claimed to have found graves, it was said that the Catholic Church had been involved in mass murder. And then in the media, the cultural genocide claims turned into physical genocide claims, hence the unrest and protests. Now, I think it's important to say here that those GPR, the ground penetrating radar findings, are incredibly dubious. All they can do is find soil disruptions. They can't find, they can't substantiate if a grave is there. That requires excavation. In the sites where they have done excavation, they haven't found any graves. So at this point in time, all claims of mass murder and mass graves are unproven. So that's merely the point I'm making. I'm not speculating whether there were murders or whether there weren't, but merely that all of this extreme action came on part of unproven accusations. And also it seems that people found it very easy to believe that the Catholic Church and these residential schools were very evil and committing mass murder. And I think that says something about the climate of the time, and is in part due to damage to the Catholic Church, mainly from the onslaught of these inquiries. So I also look at the more recent European inquiries. I look at the French inquiry, which concluded in 2021. I chose this inquiry because it has a very controversial general population survey that netted 330,000 cases of child sexual abuse in France in the last 70 years. And it has been accused of being probably the most ideologically driven inquiry. So for an example of that, I'm going to move on to my next slide and show you something from the inquiry I thought was rather ideologically driven. So that was that actually the Catholic school form in and of itself is a dangerous, abusive construction. So I'll read this, or maybe you can read it. I'll give you a couple of minutes. So some people might say that's a rather unfair characterisation of the Catholic school form, right? I mean, with no other function than to learn, you know, the rational organisation of time and space. I mean, some people may actually think that's a good thing. And I think this is evidence of significant ideological bias in these inquiries. I also look at the Spanish inquiry. It also had a general population survey which netted 440,000 cases of alleged child sexual abuse, and I'll talk about that more a bit later in the talk. And not to be outdone, I can move on to Italy and the victims lobby group there, which claims there's probably 1 million cases of child sex abuse in Italy. One of my motivations for writing this book was to dissuade the Catholic Church in Italy from endorsing an inquiry. But that's also applicable for other countries where this is on the table. I think Hungary is another one, Lithuania. So motivation stands for other countries because I don't think these inquiries can be trusted, basically. So where are we now? So as I said at the start, some of the inquiries I looked at in the original book, were quite old. The Irish inquiry concluded, I think, in about 2002. So where are we now? So you see from the most up-to-date information from the report of the National Board for Safeguarding Children in the Catholic Church in Ireland, there are 4 allegations that concern the last 20 years. So there's more allegations that are historical in nature, but I mean, what we should really be interested in is if safeguarding measures are working and if the church is a safe place for children today. And I would say over the last 20 years, to have 4 allegations is a pretty good number. So with my claim, I made the major claim in my last book was that large-scale cases of child sex abuse are largely historical in the Catholic Church. In different countries, so there was a wave in different countries so the timing is a bit different. Normally, the peak cases are in the 70s, they decline in the mid-90s, they start declining in the 80s, decline significantly in the mid-90s when safeguarding measures were put in place, laws were put in place, greater awareness came about through victim lobby groups, etc. I'm not saying there's no sexual abuse or abuse otherwise in the Catholic Church. That's really an unrealistic expectation from an institution that deals with so many vulnerable people. But the question is, are we at a place where it's managed and at an acceptable level? So in terms of Ireland, I think that's the case. I also have the latest figures from the USA. I think the John Jay report was, Ireland was concluded in 2009, John Jay concluded in 2002, John Jay being the US report. So you can see the figures are a bit higher in the US, as you'd expect. And you can also see in that last period, there seems to be more allegations. That doesn't really seem to me to be a matter of concern. It could be the case of one nasty predator, but the general trend would seem to be that cases are reducing significantly and that safeguarding is working.
Sorry, can you just, so the John Jay thing concluded years ago.
Yeah.
You've got the figures that aren't from the John Jay, that are more recent figures.
Correct.
And I can't read this. What are the most recent figures? The 2020 or something? What are the figures for 2023?
Okay. The latest figures, 6 allegations.
In the whole of the US?
Yeah.
Okay.
Made in 23 that are pertaining to events that took place between 2000 and 2010, that decade.
Yeah, so we're talking about recent allegations with respect to recent alleged crimes.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Very recent.
Okay. So in terms of safeguarding in the Catholic Church, it would seem completely implausible if it wasn't working. I mean, I know of somebody who can't contact a child in his own family without having a guardian present. I know in Canada of somebody who has to report an allegation of abuse within an hour or they will be disciplined. So the safeguarding in the Catholic Church today, in most countries, although there are countries of concern, is of a very high standard and is working, I would argue. However, not everybody agrees with me. So, and this arose in my analysis of the Australian inquiry, that there was a 33-year delay with the reporting of allegations of child sex abuse. So the thought was, well, if that's the case, then maybe child sex abuse is rampant and it's going to be reported 30 years from now. So we can't trust that wave or that bell anymore. It's however, I think that's been completely disproven. I think I disproved that in the original book, and now 5 years later, that argument really doesn't hold. I mean, it seems to me that these inquiries have disrupted that reporting, and now more people are reporting, and most people who have any claim would be reporting now because there's compensation available. So in the first book, I argued the Australian inquiry claims that it's likely that there are a large number of unreported incidents of currently occurring child sex abuse that will be reported 30 years from now, given that was the average time of the delay. However, I said that's questionable because if the delay is typically 30 years, then the number of complaints in relation to incidents alleged to have taken place circa 1990 would be very high, but they're not. In fact, they're very low, and 5 years later, they continue to be low. Another problem with delayed reporting is what to do about cases of child sex abuse if you don't know about them. So there is an argument, well, even if you don't know that abuse is happening, you can still have significant oversight and monitoring systems and safeguarding to protect something that may or may not be happening. And that is a valid argument that has been made in relation to the Catholic Church in the past. However, I would also say that surely there's some mitigation on the part of bishops and the police for not doing much in terms of delayed reports of child sex abuse because there's evidential problems. That's the main concern. All right, that's the main concern, okay. In relation to the French inquiry, and this figure here about 96% of people who alleged they abused never reported their abuse. We also have the problem of non-reporting. What do you do if the cases of abuse are not going to be reported? How do you act on them? How do you know who the offenders are? How do you know how to discipline them, get them out of your order if they're not going to be reported? So I dispute the findings of this population survey. I think it was completely incompetent. But even with the figures that were of cases that reported to the French inquiry and more likely to be true, there was still a problem of reporting. Another point I have here is that in many of these inquiries, bishops are accused of having evidence of child sex abuse and not doing anything about it. An allegation of child sex, a historical allegation of child sexual abuse could be said to be weak evidence of child sex abuse. So it's quite difficult for a bishop to know what to do about a priest. If an allegation has been made about something that happened 40 years ago, there's no corroborating evidence. The bishop has a duty of care to the priest. So there's issues there that maybe weren't given, in my view, enough consideration. I'd also claim, and I found this interesting, recently I was talking to a Maris brother, and he was saying it's worth remembering in cases of religious orders that the concept of brotherhood is extremely strong, and a brother remains a brother throughout proven cases of abuse and in prison, and they will maintain their commitment because the concept of brotherhood is so strong. So that's another factor. On a related issue, it's worth mentioning problems with the removal of the statute of limitations in these cases. I've spoken about the evidential problems. They also apply here, but there's also problems that are related to insurance. I mean, insurance companies want to close the books. They don't want to know that there's open-ended claims that can come. And in addition to that, as you would all be aware, because of the low threshold of evidence, insurance companies are just not insuring the church for the abuse anymore. I actually have I don't have a link I can tell you. The name of an excellent journal article on this issue. It's by a guy called Joseph Lee. He's a canon lawyer from Melbourne. It's in the Australian Journal of Law and Religion, and it's called Religious Institutions and Personal Injury Compensation Claims for Abuse, the Noteworthy Significance of Insurance. And he claims that essentially we're all paying for it. We all pay for that lack of insurance with the Catholic Church. So let's move on to something more spicy. False allegations. So it's always known that some of the claims made to these inquiries and to compensation schemes would be false. They might be fraudulent, there might be people with mental health problems, might be vexatious claims, might be misunderstandings or mistaken identity. It was always known there would be false allegations. And in fact, the Australian National Redress Scheme, when it was getting people on board, said, we put that figure at 6% and you'll have to absorb that. And that was imagined by the church entities I spoke to as being a kind of reasonable figure. They thought that was quite low and that they could absorb that. But I don't know how they came up with that figure because, I mean, for instance, in the Murphy report, which created a representative body of cases to analyse, and all of those cases actually had material from court cases, 26% were false. I'd argued in the original book, and I still argue, the numbers were most likely to be higher, given that the threshold for evidence for compensation schemes is generally very low, and in many cases, no evidence beyond the statement is required. And I think you'd find that would be very low standard of evidence. So what's happening? You may or may not be aware of the breaking news in Australia, the scandal that the federal police are investigating a number of redress schemes and civil cases for mass fraud. Here's a few quotes from, this is a Guardian reporting of it. I'll let you read those. not a small problem, okay? This is not 6%. The police are stunned at how porous these compensation schemes are. And basically, we're in a real mess now. I think this report might be a little bit confused. The 1.3 billion, that was the total number of cases of the total number that was paid out of the Australian Redress Scheme. It's now 1.6 billion. So there may be some confusion in this report, but generally, I think it's accepted that a large number of these cases could potentially be fraudulent. It's known that the federal police were contacted by a number of provincial leaders a year ago who suspected fraud. They suspected fraud because with the redress scheme, you may or may not know, once a claim is made to the redress scheme, it goes to the relevant church body. They're allowed to look at it, they're allowed to dispute it, and they send it back. They were seeing a number of template-like accusations. So these were accusations that were identical, except for a name. And they were concerned about that. They also were aware that unscrupulous lawyers were going into prisons searching for people to make fraudulent claims. So they went to the federal police. In my original book, surprisingly, I even had an example of this. I had an example of someone who media called John J. Doe. He was taped on a jail phone planning how he was going to play the role of a victim of child sexual abuse in order to defraud the Diocese of Chicago. So it's known that this has been going on. I even mentioned an unhealthy relationship between some victim lobby groups and law firms. And this was in relation to a lawsuit against SNAP, which is a survivors network of those abused by CRES. That's a North American outfit. They claimed that SNAP exploited victims of child sex abuse by treating them solely as potential litigants who might financially boost SNAP and who might financially benefit lawyers who are intimately connected to SNAP. Further suspicions were raised in regards to the case of George Pell and broken rights here in Australia. Yet this conversation was shut down, and it was shut down because people who raised concerns were accused of re-traumatising victims, being apologists for the church, or being right-wing lunatics. Others who knew what was going on with false claims were just self-censoring. I can say that I've been the recipient of all of those criticisms, including somebody who had a footnote, Virginia Miller is probably a climate change denier too. I don't know how that's and I'd like it on the record that I'm not. But it is very effective. And this book has been a bit of a social experiment for me. So I know, for one thing, how difficult it is to get these kind of books published, and I'm eternally grateful to Florence University Press. But I'm reading more self-published books these days and giving them attributing to them more value, because I know how difficult it is to get things published. And in relation to the Canadian case, there's actually a self-published book called A Grave Error. That's a very well done book. And luckily for them, it became a bestseller. So a self-published bestseller is good on you. But I mean, I have looked at media reports about other critics, and so and so is said to be a lunatic, conspiracy theorist, vaccine denier, and I take all of these things with a grain of salt these days because it's a weapon to shut down the conversation. And now the conversation was shut down, we're in a mess. A number of a considerable, not inconsiderable amount of money has been paid to criminals. So now, and I know a lot of people don't really think much about this, but where does the money come from? Well, it comes largely in the Catholic Church from charitable funds, number of religious orders going broke, some dioceses in the US filing for bankruptcy. I mean, I know a group in Italy that's madly selling off all their property. And sadly, it has to be said, I spoke to a provincial leader who said some of the charitable works funds were funding life-maintaining charitable works. And he said there's nothing more devastating than making the conversation and saying, we can't pay this money to you anymore, and knowing the consequences of it. So these fraudulent criminal claims are not inconsequential. A last point on that, and this is often talked about in terms of fraudulent claims, is exaggerated claims as well. So how the payment system works with all these compensation schemes is you're obviously paid more, the more extreme the abuses, and there is some thought that many claims are exaggerated in order to obtain money that people aren't entitled to, basically. So now we get on to the new trend in inquiries into child sex abuse, and that is these mass numbers, and they come from general population surveys or crime multiplying exercises. So the first inquiry to do this and make a big splash, so to speak, was the French inquiry. They surveyed 28,000 people. It was said to be a representative panel. 0.17% of women and 0.69% of men alleged they were sexually abused by Catholic clerics or members of religious orders. This was then extrapolated to the population of France, and it's released, and it was the first thing that was released from this inquiry to the media were these figures. These figures were released before the inquiry was actually released. The figures are that 216,000 people are alleged victims of sexual abuse by Catholic priests or members of religious orders. The number jumps up to 330 if you include lay church workers. So I spend considerable time in the new book criticising this general population survey. Here are the main problems that I feel that I've identified with it. So the definition of child sexual abuse is too broad. So one example is the French inquiry used for some odd reason an outdated age of majority, which was 21. So a child is considered to be 21. I think the age of consent in France is 14 or 15. And there's other ways that the definition is quite broad. Survey didn't take into consideration participation bias, which is known with quota sampling, which is the mode of the methodology that they used. Survey did not take into consideration the possibility of false allegations. They just said there's few false allegations, but as we've just seen, well, there's considerable false allegations in terms of compensation claims. As we said, all of these claims were anonymous, which raises a possibility that they could potentially be false, or some of them could potentially be false. Survey didn't take into consideration a decrease in absolute numbers of child sex abuse over time. However, in another part of the inquiry, it was established that the Catholic Church in France had significantly less involvement in schooling and other services related to children. So just on the matter of access, it would be reasonable to assume that cases would reduce. And there is a global trend of cases of child sexual abuse reducing. Average age of alleged victims in the general population survey remains stable. This is not consistent with data from other inquiries which show the age of victims generally increased over time. And also, interestingly, it wasn't consistent with the data of actual complaints that were made to another department in the inquiry. So there was some internal inconsistency with this. But I'm not finished. A further problem, so of the people who've been abused, 4% said they reported their abuse to the church, but the church said, well, we don't have any evidence of this in our archives. So I think there were 13,000 allegations that were supposedly missing. The argument was that the church was covering up and had destroyed documents. There was no inquiry, didn't entertain even the possibility that their extrapolation was incorrect. Well, this was another problem for the inquiry. So for their figures to be correct, every perpetrator had to have abused 69 children. And that's a very high number of children for every offender to abuse. Certainly there are offenders with very high numbers of victims, 300, for example, but they are the rarer cases. That is not usually every offender. And this is quite commonsensical, because the higher the victim numbers, the greater the possibility of the person being caught and some kind of intervention happening. So it was thought that this number of every perpetrator had to have abused at least 69 victims seemed rather implausible. It was also claimed that it was not statistically significant that less than 1% of the people who made a claim in the general population survey had been abused by a cleric or someone in religious order. It's just not statistically significant to be extrapolated to the population of France.
Sorry, can I ask, well, there are issues with the design of the questionnaire, because we know that even a simple thing like a voting and associating that with some questions about issues can be severely, unless it's very, very thoughtfully done, can severely bias your results.
Well, yeah, I haven't seen the survey question, and I'd love to see it, right? Because what I know from all these other inquiries, the scale of child sex abuse can be very broad. You know, I was swimming and a nun stared at me suspiciously. I was abused. Some people, he cuddled me. I don't know if he was sexually aroused. Maybe I was abused. I have a repressed memory of being abused. I'm not sure if it's true or not. so it's, when you compare that to, say, voting polls. So with voting polls, this is a rather straightforward question. Are you an immediate? Are you going to vote for X or Y?
Yeah, but I was thinking where it's linked with polls on attitudes on issues related to it, there are very clear protocols that need to be needed. So your answers, the answering on one set doesn't unduly influence the answering on another set of issues.
Sure.
And that's not anything as emotionally and psychologically as complicated as what you're doing. I would have thought it would have been a nightmare to design a questionnaire that gave you anything that you could rely on.
Well, the other thing is, I wonder about the representative panel. I think that's another, I didn't look into that, but I think that might also be an area of worthy of investigation. But I'll move on.
Sorry, Virginia, we've got 19 minutes to go, and we want to allow some time for discussion.
Okay, I'll
If you're able to bring it home in
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Spanish Inquiry did the same thing. They needed 440,000. If you want to look at this, in Italy, the victim lobby group are predicting 1 million. But this is just, you know, here's a number of priests, let's multiply it by 2, 4, 6, 8, and let's say there's 250 victims per person. Well, there's 1 million people who've probably been abused. Well, it just doesn't seem very credible to me. All right, I'll skip over this. But I have to end with this one. So,
As a New Zealander.
not as a New Zealander. Well, I'm embarrassed. So the New Zealand inquiry didn't do a general population survey, but it used crime multipliers. So I won't go into it too much detail. And they also found netted a large number, 256,000 people have been abused in New Zealand. But when I was updating the material from the original book, I found this quote that was really interesting. It was from a Q&A on the website of the New Zealand Inquiry. How does the Commission justify this large number? The number of persons who made a complaint is less than 3% of the high-end number. Their answer was, while this is low compared to the estimated cohort of those abused in care, we expect these numbers to substantially increase over time with our targeted community engagement and outreach and increased publicity and resulting public awareness at the times of our public hearings. This disappeared. This isn't on their website anymore. So the interesting question is, well, did those people appear? Because they expected them to. No, 2,300 people appeared. And if we just go back to Italy.
Sorry, hang on, just get there. So the report said that they predicted on the basis of its crime multiplier that it'll be 200. What did you say?
256,000
And they
people.
said that's what's going to happen.
They're going to appear with our community engagement.
Yeah, in the year so and so.
Yeah.
But interestingly, that prediction was
False.
would be either verified or falsified, because when the year came, the actual number that came forward was
2,300.
right. So that's
So
A little bit of.
in terms of Italy, the number of accusations they have, the victim lobby group that are claiming there's 1 million cases, is 178.